Hello, my name is Amy Elder, and I am an LPN to BSN student at Indiana State University, and today we are going to be talking about human trafficking. I would like to start with a quote from Senator Jackie Rosen from Nevada. She said, "Human trafficking is a community-wide problem, and as such, it requires community-wide solutions." There are 6 objectives that will be covered in this presentation. By the end of the presentation, the viewer should be able to define human trafficking, recognize the most common demographics affected by human trafficking, distinguish common misconceptions surrounding human trafficking, identify the risk factors for victimization of human trafficking, analyze the factors that allow for human trafficking to occur, and summarize prevention efforts and victim support options. At this point, please stop and take the pretest to assess your knowledge about human trafficking. The pretest can be accessed by clicking the link accompanying this presentation down below. What is human trafficking? Human trafficking is a severe form of exploitation of another person involving force, fraud, or coercion for labor or commercial sexual purposes. Trafficking does not require transportation of persons across state or country borders and may involve U.S. citizens and/or foreign nations. There are more people affected by human trafficking than is commonly realized. Estimates of millions of people each year around the world are victimized by human trafficking. Within that estimate, 80% of trafficking victims worldwide are women and children, with women taking up the majority of that percentage. The U.S. Department of State estimates that 14,500 to 17,500 people are trafficked in the United States alone each year. The average age of trafficking victims in the United States is 20 years old. Most trafficking victims belong to vulnerable populations, so that includes women, children, migrants, minorities, runaways, abused children and women, and then people who are in poorer classes. The potential traffickers exploit the lack of opportunities and promise good jobs or education in order to coerce people into the trade. This diagram presents some data that was gathered in 2019 since 2007 for human trafficking statistics in Oregon. The Pacific Northwest is an area that has particularly high levels of human trafficking that occur. So it's interesting to take a look at those percentages and kind of see within just that year of 2019, there were 497 contacts made through phone calls, texts, online chats, emails, and web forums of people who were reported for human trafficking that were victims or survivors of human trafficking within the 132 cases that were reported that year. There are several myths and misconceptions about human trafficking that detract from the importance of the situation surrounding it. One of the most common myths is that human trafficking does not occur in the United States and it only happens in other countries. But the fact is, human trafficking exists in every country, including the United States. It exists nationwide in cities, suburbs, rural towns, and possibly even in your own community. Another myth is that human trafficking victims are only foreign-born individuals or those who are poor. But really, human trafficking victims could be any age, race, gender, or nationality, and they may come from any socioeconomic group. Another myth is that human trafficking is only sex trafficking, and while that is partially true because there is sex trafficking as well, it's not the only type of human trafficking. Forced labor is a huge component to human trafficking, and victims can be found from legitimate and illegitimate labor industries, including sweatshops, massage parlors, agriculture, restaurants, hotels, and domestic services. Another myth of individuals who would be forced or coerced into commercial sex acts to be victims of human trafficking. But under U.S. federal law, any minor age 18 or under the age of 18 who is induced to perform commercial sex acts is a victim of human trafficking, regardless of whether he or she is forced or coerced. So if you're a minor, it's automatically considered human trafficking. Another myth is that human trafficking and human smuggling are the same thing, but human trafficking is not technically smuggling. Trafficking is based on exploitation and does not require the movement of people across borders, although sometimes they can overlap and kind of get mingled together. And another myth, finally, is that human trafficking victims will attempt to seek help when in public. This is one of the biggest myths that can cause a lot of damage for people who are involved with human trafficking. It's often a hidden crime, and victims may be coerced through threats of or violence. They may fear retaliation from the traffickers, and including dangers to their families, and they may not be in possession or have control of their identification documents. And these are all things that can prevent them from reaching out for help on their own, of their own volition. So a big question is, what are the risk factors for human trafficking? Characterizing risk factors for commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking is necessary to understanding the etiology of these problems and to create interventions for preventing them. The diagram here kind of shows that there's a scale of different risk factors, including individual risk factors, family and relationship risk factors, the community risk factors, and then also a larger picture of the societal risk factors as well, which one of the biggest things is lack of awareness. And then in the community level, having social norms or social isolation, under-resourced schools and neighborhood and communities. And then in the family or the relationship risk factors is usually family conflict or dysfunction. And individual risk factors include history of child abuse, neglect, homelessness, runaway, history of being system involved, so like juvenile justice or even foster care. And then the stigma and discrimination that comes along with being involved with trafficking. Another important question to ask is, why does human trafficking keep happening? What is making it where this is something that we still are having to deal with year after year? Part of it is the payoff. So there's a high reward for relatively low risks. Traffickers can make a lot of money, and since it's very much underground, they don't have a lot of fear of punishment or legal consequences. The other big issue is that the supply and demand is very out of sync. So there's really high demand on the black markets for both sex trafficking and for labor trafficking, and the black market really seeks to fill those high demands on supply. Systemic inequalities and disparities, so mass displacements, conflicts, extreme poverty, no access to education and jobs. These are all harmful social norms that can cause situations of trafficking. Another one is the use of the internet to target unsuspecting and vulnerable victims. Online grooming is something that has become more prevalent in recent times with so many social media outlets and online dating sources, especially for children and young people. And part of the problem is there's a lot of legal loopholes that online sites can kind of slip through the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. So they're not being held responsible for illegal acts of trafficking that are happening on those pages. Prevention of human trafficking is something that needs to have a higher priority. So how do we stop it? The first thing is to raise awareness of human trafficking so it's removed from the shadows and can properly be defeated. And that way their stigma can be removed as well from victims and survivors that are currently placed on them, where we have a lot of victim blaming that occurs. One way to help that is provide prevention education to youth before traffickers reach them, so they can be self-aware as well in what the risks are and how to avoid being entrapped with it, and offering support systems for at-risk youth, intervening to rescue traffickers when victims are recognized, or if they aren't willing to step out right then, at least plant the seed that you can help them and give them the information they need to get out of the situation. Another big step is supporting the survivors. So when people do get out of trafficking situations, it can be very scary and daunting to come back into society, especially with the stigma that we talked about earlier. So having support for them and the trauma that they went through rehabilitation back into normal society is very important as well. Also, demand for deterrence for the human trafficking in general. So naming and shaming buyers of sex and increasing financial and criminal penalties for buyers of sex is something that really needs to be worked on. And then working to reduce the number of traffickers and including increasing financial and criminal penalties, so that people have some sort of negative ramifications for it being involved in trafficking and causing that kind of harm to other humans. It's important for people in the community to be able to identify the at-risk warning signs, particularly for the youth. Some of those include staying out later than usual, sudden changes in friends, or withdrawing from activities, developing a relationship that seems too close with somebody they only know on social media or online, or signs of abuse and distress, runaway youth, or people who suddenly have significantly older boyfriends or girlfriends, or have been having multiple STIs or STDs, are all indications that they could be involved with trafficking. One of the biggest ways that you can help in the fight against human trafficking is through advocacy. If you suspect someone is a victim of trafficking, you can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline toll-free 24/7 to take reports on potential human trafficking. You can text them as well. You can contact them online through a chat. And then also report missing children or child pornography to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Or you can actually go through the cyber line as well if you don't want to call. If you're not having access to that, or you're not seeing any of those things directly, you can also support the victims and the survivors and find ways to help get them the help that they need and help raise awareness for the overall impact of trafficking has on your communities. At this point, please stop here and take the post test to assess what you have learned about human trafficking. The post test can be accessed by clicking the link down below accompanying this presentation. If you would like to print out this handout with information regarding human trafficking and the resources that are available, please use the accompanying link, which can be found down below.